On this episode of Newt's World, how close are we to a crisis with China and the Taiwan Straits? My guest today is Dr. Weifang Zhang, Senior Advisor for the Office for Fiscal and Regulatory Analysis at the America First Policy Institute and an affiliate scholar at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He leads the Open Source Policy Change Index, PCI, project, which uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to read large volumes of propaganda text to analyze and predict government's actions based on their words. Using PCI, Dr. Zhang is out with a new paper entitled Predicting Taiwan Strait Crisis Using Propaganda, a New Open Source Method. Weifang, welcome, and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for having me again.
Before we get into China and Taiwan, I have to ask you, because I'm fascinated by the whole process, the system you've now built scans how many items a day on average?
We catch every news article that comes out of the Chinese propaganda machine, by which I mean the People's Daily, not only the People's Daily, the central newspaper, but also now many other provincial and ministerial newspapers from China. So we collect them every day.
The system reads Chinese?
Yes.
Do you also monitor Taiwan?
We also just started monitoring news feed from Taiwan too. It takes two parties to take part in the conflict, which is a big part of why we are now expanding the data collection to Taiwan.
When you're looking at all this material, how fast does your system analyze it?
Well, we catch all these content as it comes out, and then we have in the back end a series of models that ingest these data into the algorithms, and then we do our calculations for different purposes. And for example, we monitor Chinese officials, their rise and fall in political fortune in Beijing. Oftentimes we catch ahead of time the fall of key officials when they got into trouble with the authorities, with Xi Jinping. That was showed up in propaganda too, or including their rise. Sometimes, you see black horses coming up in the scene in Beijing. And the same is true for monitoring Chinese attitude toward Hong Kong, Taiwan, the US on a number of issues.
Given this kind of quantitative analysis, are you sort of looking for word patterns, or what are you looking for?
The most important thing we look for is anomalies, things that deviate from the trend or the baseline. And this is very unique when it comes to analyzing authoritarian regimes' propaganda, because we are not really talking about news, the real fake news, which is propaganda coming out from regimes like the Russians and Chinese. And with these regimes, we should not think of their, let's say, their newspaper or their radio broadcast as facts. We should think of them as the regime's attitude. So what's really important is to measure, to catch the moment these attitude changes, because it oftentimes indicate their intentions, Beijing's intention, Moscow's intention, Pyongyang's intention.
From that standpoint, how should Americans understand the Chinese Communist Party's view of Taiwan?
A good analogy to make is actually to look at the CCP's attitude toward student protesters, going back to 1989, the Tiananmen Square protest. And that's an excellent example. I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's also a very good example to understand how propaganda operates. Because initially, when the students were protesting in Beijing, they were advocating for a more open government, open society. To some extent, Beijing acknowledged that. They said these people, they came on with good intention, they're protesters, demonstrators, and they all have a hope for a better future for the country. But then when things got out of hand, it's actually necessary, tragically necessary, for the regime to change how they describe these students. They would say, because if they're good people, you can't crack down, you can't send in troops to kill them, right? And so they had to become, in some sense, in the propaganda sense, bad people. So what we saw in 1989, looking back, is that the propaganda dramatically changed how they describe these students. At the end, they became like morons in the newspaper. And that's needed before they could actually send in troops. The same logic holds here when it comes to the Chinese attitude toward Taiwan, because the ordinary Chinese people, they don't really hate the people in Taiwan. But war or conflict, kinetic conflict, requires negative sentiment, requires popular support for the regime to, send missiles over. And so this is exactly what we're monitoring, is how the regime, if at any point trying to move the public attitude to the negative side toward Taiwan, which is something that happened very significantly in 1995 to 1996 for the last Taiwan Strait crises. I know, Mr. Speaker, you had some personal connection to this episode because I know you went to Taiwan the year after. Is it 1997?
I think it was in 97, but in 96, I was on TV saying that President Clinton was right to send a second aircraft carrier into the Straits and that we were sending a clear signal to Beijing that, in fact, we would fight if they tried to invade Taiwan. When I visited, it was a fascinating experience. But as you look at the data sets that you're getting, what can you tell? For example, the military leaders are making predictions, and it seems to me that at times they're this is Chinese Communist military leaders, their predictions would imply some kind of combat in the not very distant future.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. But the same is true for American military leaders, too. There are all sorts of estimates, right, predictions about when something like it would happen. Some said 2024. Luckily, that has passed. Now, a lot of eyes are on 2027, 2029. I think the Chinese military leaders did the same, but I think a lot of these military assessments, they focus more on the capabilities, like when China has the capability to overtake Taiwan. But that depends on how much interference we see from other parties, such as the US, the rest of the Western world, and maybe Japan. So all these are important variables to the capability portion. But I think from propaganda data, we see more of them.
Do you see the Chinese communists that are showing up in your data sets becoming more bellicose and more leaning towards a military operation?
Not in a very recent month. So we developed this AI algorithm to learn from what happened back in 1996, arguably the most intensive crisis in recent times. And then we used what we learned from that episode to monitor subsequently former Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan a couple of years ago, as well as the meeting between the Taiwanese president and former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. What appears to be the pattern now is that there are strong reactions, I think, when highly placed U.S. officials visit Taiwan or meet with Taiwanese leaders, but the magnitude has decreased.
It's almost like what was initially a crisis has now begun to be, they grumble, but it's now sort of normal to have visits. I remember originally, boy, it was like a giant crisis. Even to land in San Francisco or Los Angeles was a huge deal. And now it's just kind of background grumbling.
Right. So if you compare from speaker to speaker, right? So from you, Mr. Speaker, to Speaker Pelosi, Speaker McCarthy, the magnitude of reactions from Beijing has declined, which actually shows a lot of value of demonstrating American strength in this situation. When we show strength, Beijing will think twice about how aggressive they want to be. And that's really the purpose I mentioned of your visit to Taiwan too back in the days.
You've developed this large language model. Does it actually report back to you in Chinese or does it translate into English?
It reports back to me in Chinese, which is where my human intelligence comes in, is that I would interpret that in English, writing to our audiences, our readers. But the machine is fully operating in the Chinese language, not only Chinese language, actually, the Chinese culture and Chinese way of news reporting in the system, because that's all we ingest into the model.
As an amateur, I read about the idea that when you have an artificial intelligence model like yours, it then has to go through a period of being trained. What does that mean?
Let's start with what's called large language models, which is basically models built on every word ever uttered on the internet, possibly the big companies they can possibly find, right? Which include Chinese language. But that gigantic lake of data, if you will, is not particularly helpful when it comes to China, for example, China versus Taiwan, because it's a very specific context, right? So the training in this case means if you just ask a question to the AI in Chinese, it would respond to you, but it will be based on the vast number of Chinese language material on the internet, which included Chinese language that were data spoken on the US internet because there are Chinese immigrants here, right? But their Chinese language content is very different from Chinese language content coming out from the CCP. In our case, when we do these projects, training means to steer the AI to focus more on content in the propaganda coming out from the propaganda system. So pay more attention to those and ignore whoever, Chinese immigrants in San Francisco are talking about in blogs. Right? So that's not really relevant to the question at hand.
So as I understand it, as you were developing this, you actually were training it using the People's Daily articles during the 1995 Taiwan Strait crisis, which led to military escalation by China, Taiwan, and the U.S. I'm curious, as you went through that assessment, did you learn anything? Did you see the 1995 crisis any differently after you got the report back from the machine?
I think what surprised me the most after seeing what the machine returns is how much the role the U.S. plays in the escalation, in the whole crisis. Fundamentally, Taiwan is an issue, or reunifying with Taiwan is almost a requirement for the CCP regime. So that, in our assessment, remains the number one most important factor. But the number two most important factor was the Chinese attitude toward the United States. And that changed drastically during the crisis too. So it's not really an issue. Taiwan is not really an issue just between the mainland China and Taiwan. It's how the Beijing perceived strength of the West, which goes back to the point of when we demonstrate strength, Beijing's reaction to these, even just bilateral visits between the U.S. and Taiwan, less and less significantly over the years, in recent years. I think that should be counted as an achievement of our foreign policy rather than weakness in any sense.
So in a sense, they're a little bit less bellicose and a little bit less on the edge of war than they were in 95, 96.
Yeah, if we're just comparing from, like I said, from speaker to speaker in the last few episodes, it seems to be the case. But I also wonder, it's hard to distinguish is to what extent the weakness now in Beijing comes from the weakness of the Chinese economy or the Chinese development stage, so to speak, which really has been having a really hard time in the last few years too. So the difference between Pelosi and McCarthy, for example, could be to some extent due to the weakness of the Chinese economy that's trending down since the COVID lockdown was lifted in much of China.
The process that we're in the middle of right now, Xi Jinping clearly is faced with, even before Trump and the tariff fight, the Chinese economy was in significant trouble, both because the one-child policy has now led to a dramatic decline in the workforce, because they had overbuilt entire towns. I mean, not just overbuilt buildings, but entire towns. They had overextended themselves in terms of internal lending. That could either lead him to be more aggressive so people would pay attention to and rally around nationalism, or it could lead him to be more cautious because he would feel like he doesn't have as stable and solid a base. What's your hunch of how those two weigh out?
Well, I think in the end, an actual kinetic conflict or even an invasion would have to be an outcome of two things. One is the Beijing's strength internally, because that has to do with capabilities. But the other is intention, like how desperate Xi Jinping is in overtaking Taiwan. Every time I think about this, I go back to the notion of legacy, political legacy a lot in the Chinese context. If you compare Xi Jinping with his predecessors, including those you met, Mr. Speaker in Beijing, Jiang Zemin and his subordinates at the time. So if you compare, for example, from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao to now Xi Jinping, You could name a few things as greatest achievements by Jiang Zemin, for example, right? Leading China into the WTO, taking back Hong Kong and Macau, holding the Beijing Olympics. To some extent, that went to Hu Jintao as well. But if you think about Xi Jinping, he really didn't have much achievement so far. He's running the economy down to the ditch and many other things down to the ditch too. And so one argument to be made is that he is desperate in looking for achievements, particularly when his next 5-year term comes up, which is 2027. I think that has a lot to do with other assessment about why the timeline has to be 2027, because by 2027, he will be seeking another run, right? And even though China does not have democracy, popular support still matters to him, and the lack of it matters even more. And so one could make the argument that taking back Taiwan in a timely manner would matter a lot to his political legacy, because so far he has none. Right? So that's, I think, a major factor. But of course, he's not going to be able to do that if the Chinese military power and economic power continue to decline, which is why I think it's very important to continue to monitor the situation, that weighing these two factors over the next few years to see which one comes out dominant.
Do you see him in that sense as being almost like an American politician, in that he wants a way out which gives him dignity and makes him important, but he may not want to risk the destruction of the regime in order to get there?
Absolutely. I think in the end, as we always say, right, foreign policy fundamentally is domestic policy. And domestic policy fundamentally is about the legacy or legitimacy, right? In a normal democratic country, legacy takes the form of having more votes, right, in the next election and more support for the party if you do well. But in China, I think the bar is much lower. But if the legacy is low enough, it might trigger a lot of oppositions, even from within the elites, right? We have seen that actually during the COVID lockdown period, when people couldn't stand it. We see university students coming out to protest too. And that makes people think again to look back to find a similarity to, for example, student protesters in Tiananmen Square. So all these are very unpleasant images for the CCP.
One of the things that you came up with that I was surprised by is that your analysis of mass scale of information shows a real decline in reporting about the outside world by the People's Daily, that it's just less and less important than it used to be. What do you think is going on?
We actually just published a journal article about this in a Journal of Contemporary China, where we actually track how the CCP mentions all the different countries, including Taiwan, the US, and everywhere else, versus any content that's purely domestic. So the CCP's vision, I think, in the last almost 20 years now, has increasingly narrowed. So their eyes are more on domestic issues, less on the outside world. Initially, I think that's because the trading with a lot of outside world, or engaging with a lot of outside world, becomes less critical. Like, for example, they used to emphasize Europe a lot, but not right now. I think CCP doesn't think Europe is relevant because Europe has been in some sort of a decline, right? But in later years, even the attention to the US has declined. And I think that it's not really an indication of the America in decline, but it's an indication that Xi Jinping himself is more and more narrow-minded. And I think that's a very dangerous situation to be in, because when you don't even report to the outside world, not to say the reporting is accurate, but when you report even to a lesser extent, it makes all the elites in the society and everyone else in China more narrow-minded, because that's the only source already, right, to the outside world. And even that is not covering a lot.
I mean, it seems to me like they're beginning to move more and more inwardly oriented and less aggressively trying to become a worldwide power, because they just have too many domestic problems. I mean, does that seem accurate to you?
To a large extent, that's not the same to say China's actual activities in terms of engaging with the outside world are necessarily in decline. We have seen the continued effort to boost up the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, right? China is still trying to forge all these collaborations with the Belt and Road countries in Asia, in Africa, or in South America. But the way they approach these projects has also changed. In the past, they emphasized more on economic development, but now they emphasize more integrating them into the Chinese values because they come up with these value system that they basically try to turn all these other countries to the same way of thinking as the CCP has in Beijing. So that's a narrow-minded vision, not necessarily a narrow-minded activity.
It's always struck me that they're so good at running a totalitarian system. And they've developed all of these cameras and facial recognition and massive ability to track a billion people, that if I were a local dictator, I might like to have the Chinese come and show me how to make sure that I'm totally secure. And in that sense, they may have something to offer that we don't have.
Well, actually, the Chinese have offered that, Mr. Speaker, to a lot of developing countries. The Chinese technologies have, over the years, powered many surveillance systems in African countries. And some of these episodes have come up in the news reporting, how they help these non-democratic regimes to monitor their own people, which is why I think in the U.S. it's really a justified concern on a lot of technologies we have here, because they could potentially, and some did, provide the capabilities for Beijing to monitor us. And we're talking about Huawei, we're talking about TikTok.
TikTok's a perfect example. Huawei, which is one of the major failures I had in the first Trump administration, I kept trying to warn them that Huawei is very dangerous and very powerful and currently very successful worldwide. It provides access for the Chinese communists that is, I think, very sobering.
Absolutely. And I think there are two layers of the dangers here. TikTok, Mr. Speaker, is more on the propaganda through content. So they created pro-China content, right, to try to influence our mind. But Huawei is in a vulnerability where information itself could be tapped into by the CCP. And we actually have that with TikTok too, because the way TikTok collects information is down to your fingertip, like how you scroll on your screen and how you select content. And in my opinion, it's actually very damaging in the longer term, because when apps are able to monitor our behavior, it would be able to learn our preferences, like how we think about things, right? How American voters think about different issues. And knowing that it's incredibly valuable because that's a huge intelligence. It has a huge value on intelligence.
I buy a lot of books on Amazon, and it now intuits what I might be interested in based on my behavior. So the gigantic system that Amazon has is sort of studying me and figuring out what to offer me in a way that is, on the one hand, is very practical and very helpful. On the other hand, it's a little scary.
It's actually very scary. Even Amazon could potentially learn your schedule, Mr. Speaker, like when you would scroll on the app to shop, they would figure out your sleep patterns, when you couldn't sleep in the middle of the night and you're trying to buy some gadget on Amazon. Now imagine all that, like every company in the world is doing that. But imagine a world where every company submits that information to the CCP. That's their vision of governance, a global governance. And we should try very hard to prevent that from happening.
So do you think you'll extend this new methodology to looking at other countries?
We have. Last year, we put out an algorithm that monitors Pyongyang to North Korea. So we have gathered the North Korean content, and we made the similar algorithm to detect whether Kim Jong-un is thinking differently.
Given how closed that dictatorship is that very revealing, doing it that way? I mean, do you pick up cues and indications?
Yeah, I wasn't sure when I started the project, but it performed surprisingly well. For example, we picked up signs of significant nuclear weapon tests shortly before. In some ways that you somehow just changed the tone and tenor on their front page. So that model we did was as of last year. So this year we are going to render the model live in the sense that we'll be like getting the content from Pyongyang every day and updating the algorithm every day. So that's one of our next projects too.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing some fascinating stuff, and I hope maybe in a year we can come back and you'll read us into all the different things you're learning, because you found a way to really have a big impact, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for saying that. I would love to come back. Also, let me clarify, the AI is doing most of the work now. It's no longer me, which is a very reassuring development.
I am personally happy to still believe that the human had a role in this thing. It makes me feel better. Weifang, I want to thank you for joining me and helping us better understand both your system, which is amazing, and how to analyze and think about China's plans for the Taiwan Straits. Our listeners can follow your work by visiting the America First Policy Institute's website at americafirstpolicy.com. And it's really been very enlightening, and I really appreciate you visiting us again.
Well, thanks again for having me, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. Weifang Zhang. You can read his new paper, Predicting Taiwan Strait Crisis Using Propaganda, a New Open Source Method, on our show page at newsworld.com. Newsworld is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newsworld, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newsworld can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newsworld.